The slap from her grandson didn't just cause physical pain. It was a powerful shock that tore apart everything the family had built over the years. When love and sacrifice are not appreciated, she had to face a harsh reality. Would she continue to give herself entirely to a family that didn't recognize the value of her sacrifice? This story isn't just a family tragedy. It's a journey of self-discovery amidst brokenness and the quest for respect. The price to regain freedom and power might make you rethink what you're willing to sacrifice and what you truly deserve in return. Before we begin this story, let me know where you are listening from in the comments below. My name is Ellen. I'm 65 years old, and what I'm about to tell you today will forever change the way you see your own family. I never thought I would have to witness a moment like that. I have lived for more than 60 years as a mother, as a grandmother, and I have endured countless hardships in this life. But that moment, that slap, was something I could never have imagined. It didn't just hurt me physically. It pierced my heart, striking at what little pride remained in a woman who had sacrificed her entire life for her family. My life before that seemed steady, a simple, quiet life in a small town in Georgia. Everyone knew everyone, yet no one truly understood what went on inside another person's heart. I lived with my son Michael, my daughter-in-law Heather, and my grandson Ethan. When my husband passed away, Michael told me I should move in with them. He said I could help take care of Ethan, help around the house. I didn't think twice and agreed immediately. I thought it was the right thing to do. I was Michael's mother, Ethan's grandmother. Of course I would help my family. A simple decision, one that seemed so harmless. At first, I didn't feel troubled. Michael said I could help watch over Ethan, drive him to and from school, cook dinner for the family, clean the house, fold the laundry. Those were things I had done all my life. I even loved doing them because I believed they were how I could contribute to my family's life. I loved watching Ethan play in the yard, seeing the smile on my son's face each evening when he came home from a long day at work. Those were the moments I had lived my whole life hoping for. But I didn't realize I was slowly becoming an invisible part of this house. Indispensable, yet never respected. Life went on quietly, the same days repeating, filled with care and affection. But within that calm, something in me began to change. I didn't realize what I had become in this family. A tool that saved them time, that did the things they didn't want to do. Everything I did, taking Ethan to school, making dinner, cleaning the house, folding their clothes, was taken for granted. I never received a thank you from Michael or Heather. They treated it as my duty, as if I had no right to anything but service, and I never spoke up. I silently did everything, thinking that was how I showed my love. But that day changed everything. I remember it clearly. That afternoon, Ethan had just finished playing his video game and was sitting quietly in front of the screen. Sunlight streamed through the window, making the dust float gently in the air. I was standing in the living room, folding Michael's clothes. Simple chores, the kind of small tasks I thought I would be doing for the rest of my life. And then, the moment happened. Ethan suddenly stood up and came toward me. I didn't even have time to react. With a swift motion, he slapped me across the face. It wasn't a gesture of anger, nor an act of rebellion. It was simply indifference, a gesture of pure, utter disrespect. I froze, unable to say a word. The slap felt like a blow straight to my heart, to my dignity. It wasn't the sting on my skin that hurt most, but the pain of realizing that I no longer held any value in the eyes of my own family. I raised my hand to my cheek, feeling the burning sensation, but that pain was nothing compared to what I felt inside. The slap wasn't just a violation of my body, it was a cruel declaration. I was no longer an important part of this family. I was no longer the mother, the grandmother they needed. I was just a free servant, a tool to save them time and money. Michael and Heather didn't react. They just stood there. No surprise, no concern. They simply looked at me with cold detachment, as if nothing had happened. Heather chuckled and said, "If you're here to look after him, you better get used to his jokes. Now focus on folding the laundry." That sentence was a second slap, one that struck straight at my pride, at the love and faith I had given this family all these years. I stood there, motionless, my hand still on my cheek. I couldn't utter a word. It felt as if everything inside me crumbled. I had lived my whole life loving them, caring for them, believing I was an indispensable part of this family. But now I realized I was only a tool, something to be used when needed and cast aside when not. No apology came, no sign of concern. Michael said nothing. Heather simply went back to what she was doing. Everything continued as if nothing had happened. But inside me, everything had changed forever. I couldn't stand there another second. I quietly walked into the kitchen, the only place where I could escape the cold air, where I didn't have to face their indifferent eyes. The pain inside me rose like a tide, unbearable. I knew, with aching clarity, that I was no longer part of this family. I was invisible, worthless. At that moment, I didn't know what to do. I couldn't express what was raging inside me because I knew no one would understand. Michael would think I was overreacting. Heather would treat it as something trivial. I couldn't keep living in this lie. I had done everything for them, for this family, yet in return, I received nothing but silent blows. That slap, painful as it was, made one thing clear. I could no longer live under such contempt. I stood there in the kitchen, still feeling the sting on my cheek. But that wasn't what hurt the most. It was the pain in my heart that took my breath away. I was no longer a mother, no longer a grandmother, just a tool. And I had had enough. That slap, no matter how many times I've tried to forget it, keeps echoing in my mind. The physical pain faded quickly, but the wound inside me, the feeling of being forgotten, of being disrespected, has clung to me every single day. Every morning when I wake up, I look at myself in the mirror and wonder whether I am still the same person or just an empty shell existing in this house. I can't find the words to express what's overflowing in my heart. Last night, I tried to sleep, but my eyes wouldn't close. I kept hearing that slap, seeing the indifference, the lack of respect in the eyes of Michael, of Heather, and even Ethan. The next morning, I still had to get up, as always, to make breakfast for the family. Those daily chores had become a habit, a part of the life I had lived for so many years. But today, I could feel it clearly. Everything had changed. That slap had shattered all the beliefs I once held, everything I thought was right. Cooking breakfast, preparing meals, they used to mean something to me. But now, I couldn't do it like a machine anymore. I couldn't keep acting like a servant in my own home, the place I had devoted so many years to. Everything felt different now. Michael and Heather were the same as always, Neither of them asked how I was after what happened yesterday. They ate breakfast hurriedly, not a single word of concern, not a question about how I felt. Heather was absorbed in her phone. Michael focused on his work, his desk always piled high with papers. I looked at them, but I couldn't see love in their eyes anymore, only indifference, emptiness. We sat there, eating in silence, in a suffocating atmosphere, as if everyone in the house was trying to avoid the truth, to pretend nothing had happened. Ethan sat across from me, eating casually, as if nothing had changed. He didn't understand the pain I was going through. He was just a child, innocent, blameless, and yet I couldn't stop feeling heartbroken. I was the one who raised him, who loved him deeply, and now he had become part of the same indifference that was consuming this home. I wanted to look at him, to ask why he had done it, why he had struck me. But I couldn't, because he was just a boy. All I could do was watch him eat, like every other morning, while my heart filled with disappointment. Breakfast ended in silence. Michael said nothing except to mention his plans for the day. Heather just nodded, barely acknowledging anyone around her. Everything continued, as if nothing had happened. And I went back to my chores. I cleared the table, wiped it down, washed the dishes. But my mind kept replaying that slap, the way I was treated in my own home. The pain of being a mother, a grandmother, forced to live in contempt and disrespect. It was unbearable. After Michael and Heather left for work, I continued cleaning. But my mind was elsewhere. I couldn't focus. All I could think about was the way they treated me. How could I keep living in this house when they didn't see me as a person, only as a tool to save them time and money? I couldn't bear the silence anymore. I needed to know the truth. Did they still see me as part of this family? Or was I just something useful, something they used to make their lives easier? Did they love me the way I had loved them? That question circled endlessly in my head the entire day. And finally, I decided I would find out. As a way to protect myself, I started listening to what they said when I wasn't around. I knew I shouldn't, but the pain and the doubt inside me left me no choice. They didn't know I was listening, and I hadn't planned to. But what I heard left me shaken. I was in the kitchen, washing the breakfast dishes, when I began to hear their voices coming from the living room. "I just don't understand why your mother does all this," Heather said, her voice sharp and irritated, as if scolding me. "Do you think she's actually happy doing everything around here? Does she really enjoy carrying all that burden?" Michael sighed. I could hear the weariness in his voice. "She's just an old lady, Heather. She doesn't work anymore and she likes doing these things. You know, we save thousands of dollars a year because of her. We don't have to pay for a housekeeper, and Ethan doesn't have to go to daycare. She's helping us a lot." Those words hit me like a punch to the face. I couldn't believe Michael had said that. I wasn't a tool. I wasn't free labor. I was his mother, Ethan's grandmother. I had sacrificed my whole life to love and care for them. And yet, they saw me as nothing but a means to save money. Heather went on. "But she acts like we're supposed to be grateful for it. It's exhausting, Michael." Grateful? I never asked for gratitude. All I wanted was respect, to be seen as a person, as a member of this family, not as some convenient helper they could use whenever they needed. Heather's words felt like a knife twisting in my heart. I felt foolish. Foolish for having lived like this for so many years. I couldn't listen any longer. Their words were enough to make everything clear. I was no longer part of this family. Not a mother, not a grandmother, just a useless burden in their eyes. I ran to my room, shut the door, and sat down on the bed. Tears streamed down my face. The feeling of disappointment, of deep, aching hurt, choked me. Why had I allowed myself to live under such contempt for so long? But this couldn't go on. I couldn't live like this anymore. I needed to find myself again. I needed to stand up and demand what I deserved. I couldn't keep living in silence, trapped in pain I had inflicted on myself by accepting their cruelty. I had to reclaim my dignity, the dignity of a mother, a grandmother, a human being with feelings and self-respect. Every morning when I wake up, I feel as though the whole world has changed, not because of something grand or sudden, but because of small shifts within myself, changes I hadn't noticed until I stopped to truly look around. That slap didn't just hurt me physically. It opened a truth I had long been too afraid to face. I was no longer an important part of this family. I was no longer the mother or grandmother they loved or needed. I was merely a tool to help them save time and money. The days that followed passed in silence, a heavy, suffocating silence that made it hard to breathe. Each time I stepped into the kitchen to prepare a meal, each time I cleaned the house or did the laundry, I felt like a lifeless machine. I used to do those things out of love, believing I was helping my family, but now I knew they had never truly valued me. They had never appreciated my sacrifices. Everything I did simply made their lives easier, saving them the expense of hiring help. The pain I carried wasn't physical. It was the ache of being abandoned, dismissed, unseen. I had once believed that a mother's love, a grandmother's devotion, would always hold value in her family's eyes. But I was wrong. Michael and Heather didn't keep me here because I was family. They kept me because I was useful. That slap, Heather's words, they opened my eyes. They shattered the illusion I had lived under for years, the illusion that I mattered in their lives. In truth, I was only a piece of their convenient lifestyle. Nothing more, nothing less. That morning, I still prepared breakfast as usual, but something inside me was different. When I looked at the food I had made, the same dishes I cooked every day, I felt nothing. No joy, no pride. Everything seemed meaningless. Michael and Heather sat down and ate in silence. No words, no thanks, no acknowledgement. When Ethan finished eating, he ran outside to play without even glancing my way. In that moment, I felt like a ghost quietly standing in the kitchen, doing the things they all took for granted. But today, I wasn't the same person anymore. I felt something stirring inside me, the need to change. That slap had awakened me. It wasn't just a strike across my face. It was a strike against my dignity. I had devoted my entire life to this family, and I finally realized I couldn't go on living this way. When breakfast ended, I remained seated in the kitchen, silent. Michael and Heather went about their routines. Heather didn't even look at me. Michael disappeared into his office, drowning again in his piles of paperwork. And at that very moment, I made a decision. I could no longer live as a servant in my own home. I was exhausted from giving everything without a trace of respect in return. No one thanked me. No one saw me. I needed to stand up and reclaim what little dignity I still had. That decision didn't come easily. It was the result of days of inner struggle, of guilt for even thinking about stopping. I had spent my whole life sacrificing for them, for this family, and now I felt worthless in their eyes. But I knew that if I didn't change, I would drown in this endless cycle of pain and disappointment. That day, when Michael asked me to go outside and bring in his dry clothes, I refused. It was the first time in all the years I had lived with them that I had ever said no. I didn't want to do it anymore. I said calmly but firmly, "I'm sorry, Michael. I have plans today, and I can't do that for you." I looked him in the eyes and saw the surprise, even a trace of confusion. He wasn't used to me refusing anything. To him, I had always been the one who did everything, never asking why. Heather stood by the doorway, looking at me strangely. I could sense her irritation, but I didn't feel guilty. I couldn't keep living as someone without worth or rights in her own home. I had done enough, far too much, and now it was time to stop. No one would ever respect me if I didn't start respecting myself. After that day, every chore in the house felt heavier, but I stopped forcing myself. I began saying no, even to the smallest requests. At first, Michael and Heather said nothing. They assumed I was tired or unwell. But as days passed and they realized I was no longer doing what I used to, they started to worry. Michael went into the kitchen but couldn't prepare a proper meal. Heather struggled with the laundry, and soon the house became messy. The tasks I used to do every day had suddenly become burdens to them. And for the first time, I felt something strange. Not satisfaction, but relief. A lightness I hadn't felt in years. The freedom of no longer being forced into meaningless service. With each passing day, I felt freer. I began spending time on myself, doing things I hadn't been able to do before because I was too busy caring for everyone else. I read books. I went for walks. I even sat quietly and enjoyed moments of peace I never thought I'd have again. I had spent too long sacrificing for nothing, trapped in a life where my work went unseen and unappreciated. But change was not easy. Michael and Heather still weren't used to this new version of me. They questioned, they worried, and sometimes they complained. But I no longer cared. I knew I had made the right choice. I could no longer live under their disregard or exploitation. I needed to love myself, to respect myself, before I could ever love them again. And when I looked into the mirror at the end of the day, I no longer saw a tired, defeated woman. I saw a strong one, a woman who had finally found herself again. The silence in this house wasn't what I had expected, but it was the change I had chosen. After deciding to stop doing all the household chores, my life took an unexpected turn, one I couldn't have foreseen. Everything changed, and I began to realize that my silence, my refusal, was not only affecting Michael, Heather, and Ethan, but also myself. This silence held value, and I realized that the cost of it wasn't what I had imagined before. It wasn't just about changing habits. It was about changing the way I viewed myself and the people around me. The first day after I refused to help, I dedicated all my time to myself, doing nothing. Michael went to work, Heather stayed at home, and I was alone in my room, relaxing, reading, walking around the garden. I had never felt like this before. In the past, every day had been a series of unending chores, from morning to night. But now, without doing those things, I felt as though I had escaped from a cage. No more exhausting housework, no more constant demands from Michael and Heather. It was just me and the freedom I had never experienced before. However, as time passed, this change wasn't easy for the family. Michael began to notice that I wasn't doing anything anymore. He tried to keep everything in the house running smoothly, but he couldn't. One day, when he came home and saw the house in disarray, he didn't say anything. He quietly walked into the kitchen and tried to cook dinner. I watched him from the living room window, seeing his confusion and awkwardness as he stood before the stove. He had always relied on me to handle everything in the kitchen. But now, he didn't know what to do. Sure, he wasn't the one to do the housework, but now I wasn't there to help him. And as I watched him struggle with cooking, I couldn't help but feel a small sense of satisfaction. Michael wasn't incompetent, but he had lived his life with my help. Now that I wasn't there, he realized he had to do everything himself. I saw the tension and exhaustion on his face as he struggled to do the things I had done every day. In that moment, I felt an odd sense of peace. Not because I wanted him to suffer, but because I knew my silence, my refusal, was necessary. Sometimes, people need to understand that what you do for them is not a given. And sometimes, you need to stop so they can realize that. Heather wasn't good at housework either. She had grown accustomed to me doing everything, from cooking to cleaning. And now, she had to face these tasks on her own. One morning, I watched her struggle with the laundry, unsure of what to do first. I couldn't help but feel her failure. She used to just ask me to do it, and I would. But now, it was different. She had to do it all herself, and she wasn't happy about it. Heather had always disliked housework, and I knew she wasn't thrilled to do it. What she didn't realize was that I had been doing all those tasks for years without complaining, without asking for help. But now, when she had to face the tasks I had done, I could only watch, unable to assist. This feeling, the change within the family, wasn't easy for anyone. But I started to notice that this change was affecting me in ways I hadn't anticipated. In the past, I lived for them, for the family. I always thought that if I did everything, they would be happy, and I would be happy too. But now, as I stopped doing everything, I began to feel peace within myself. I no longer had to chase after them. I no longer had to do things that I felt brought me nothing in return. I no longer had to endure the invisible disregard. I realized I deserved respect, and this change was the only way I could find myself again. Each day that passed, Michael and Heather started to notice the difference. More and more questions began to arise. Mom's not doing anything anymore? Is she okay? What's going on? But there were no answers. I didn't want to explain. I didn't want to say too much. I had made it clear to them that I could no longer do everything, that I didn't want to continue living in self-sacrifice. They might be uncomfortable. They might not understand right away. But I knew that if I didn't change, I would just continue to be someone of no value in my own home. And I couldn't stand that anymore. Ethan also began to notice the change. He didn't understand why Grandma wasn't doing the things she used to, and he began to feel uneasy. I looked at him with a heavy heart. He was just a child, and I couldn't blame him for the change. But I couldn't help him understand that I was doing this for myself. All he knew was that Grandma wasn't doing the things she used to. But I believed that over time, he would understand. He would realize that I had sacrificed for so long and that now it was time for me to live for myself. As Michael and Heather struggled with the housework, I saw the confusion and exhaustion in their eyes. They didn't know what to do. Seeing them like this made me realize that I couldn't keep living as their tool anymore. I couldn't be invisible. I couldn't be the one doing all the work without being valued. My silence was the biggest change I could create, and I believed this change would bring good things for both me and the family. I began to spend time on myself. I stopped working. I started walking every morning, admiring the flowers in the garden I had long neglected. I began reading books I loved, books I hadn't had time for before. I took time to reflect on my life, on what I had done, and what I wanted to do in the future. What I didn't realize was that I had started to find myself again, to reclaim what I had lost over all those years of living for others. This silence held value. Its value wasn't just that I wasn't working anymore, but that I had found myself again. I had reclaimed my rights. I didn't need to live for them. I needed to live for myself. And in this silence, I felt freedom, peace, and most importantly, I felt my own worth. Since I decided to stop doing the household chores, a strange feeling has been growing inside me each day. I'm not sure how to name this feeling, but it's not regret or remorse. Rather, it feels like liberation, as though I've let go of a burden I hadn't realized was so heavy. In the past, I would work tirelessly without ever asking myself whether I even needed to do these tasks. But now, when I decided to say no to those requests, they no longer felt like an obligation. They were no longer my responsibility. That day, I sat in the kitchen, made myself a cup of coffee, sipped it slowly, and looked out the window. The room was quiet, with no sound of pots and pans, no gas stove clicking on, no chatter from Michael, Heather, and Ethan like every other day. That sense of peace felt foreign to me. I couldn't remember the last time I had the chance to enjoy this quiet. I just sat there, breathing deeply, feeling the newfound freedom that I had just gained. For breakfast that day, I did nothing for the family. I didn't cook, clean, or prepare breakfast for Michael or Heather. Instead, I took time for myself. For the first time in many years, I did only what I wanted. To me, this was a small victory, an acknowledgement of myself that I had never had before. While they ate breakfast hastily, none of them seemed to notice the silence in the house. I didn't do this to get revenge or draw attention. I did it because I realized I also had the right to live for myself. They may not have noticed it immediately, but I knew I had done the right thing. Michael was the first to notice the change. He didn't say anything at first, but I could sense his confusion when he walked into the kitchen. He looked around, as if searching for me to ask for help, like it was a long-standing habit. But today, I wasn't there to do anything for him. He quietly turned away, and in that moment, I felt a profound shift in the space, as if I were breaking something he had taken for granted all these years. When I refused Michael's request for the first time, I felt no regret. He stood right there, looking at me with confusion, as though he couldn't believe I was refusing him. "Mom, could you get the dry clothes for me?" he asked, as though he was used to me always doing everything without thinking. I looked at him, not rushing to comply as I usually did, but calmly and firmly replied, "Sorry, Michael. I have plans today, and I can't do that." I don't know if he truly understood what I said, but that didn't matter. I felt liberated, as if I had just stood up after years of accepting doing everything without ever being asked if I wanted to. And I knew this was the first step for me to start living for myself. This wasn't easy, but I knew I had to do it. Michael stood silent for a moment before quietly nodding. He didn't react strongly, but I could feel the surprise in his eyes. He couldn't understand why I had changed. In the past, He had been used to me always being ready to do anything for him. Everything had been a habit, but now I had stopped. It wasn't just a change in action, it was a change in emotion, in how I viewed myself. As he left the kitchen, I felt a deep peace within me, as if a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. Not because I wanted to make him uncomfortable or punish him, but because I realized I couldn't keep living in the shadow of my own self. I needed to assert my worth, and I couldn't do that if I kept sacrificing without receiving anything in return. Heather wasn't exempt from this change. She had become accustomed to me doing everything, from cooking to washing clothes. She had been used to asking me to do everything without worrying. But now, I wasn't doing those things anymore. She started to realize that things weren't as they used to be. In the early days, she tried to do everything on her own, but I knew she wasn't used to it. She had lived in the comfort I created. But now, with me no longer doing everything, she felt the burden I had carried all these years. The feeling when I refused wasn't cold or heartless. On the contrary, I felt a deep sense of fulfillment, a recognition of myself I had never had before. I didn't have to do everything to be loved or accepted. I could love myself without sacrificing who I was. I had the right to say no, and there was nothing wrong with that. When I said no, I not only reclaimed my power, but also began reclaiming my self-respect. My first no's weren't just words. They were affirmations of my worth. That evening, when the family sat down to dinner, the silence between us was more palpable than ever. Michael and Heather both noticed the change in me, but no one said anything. They didn't know how to face this change. For years, I had done everything for them, but now I was refusing. And that created a distance, a silence they couldn't fill with words. I didn't need to explain to them why I had changed. I didn't need to say I had sacrificed too much. They might not understand right away, but I knew this change was necessary. Sometimes, we need to live for ourselves before we can live for others. Sacrifice must come with respect. And I couldn't continue sacrificing if I wasn't receiving anything in return. Each day, I began to realize that the change in me wasn't just a change in action, but also a change in how I viewed this family. I was no longer the one doing everything for them. I wasn't responsible for their happiness anymore. I was just a part of the family, a person who had the right to love and care for herself. And with each no, I said, I was gradually reclaiming my power and my value. I can't forget the look in Michael's eyes when I refused his request for the first time. In that look, there was surprise, confusion, and a hint of disappointment, as though he couldn't believe that I could change like this. I had always been the one to help, the one who never turned down his requests. But today, I said no. And that word didn't just refuse a specific task. It was a clear message to my family. I was no longer the mother or grandmother they could exploit unconditionally. That day, Michael didn't say anything more after I turned him down. He simply stood in silence for a moment, and then went to his office. I couldn't guess what was going on in his mind, but I could sense his confusion. He had spent his whole life with me, always there to help, to meet every need without ever asking for anything in return. And when I began to change, when I started setting boundaries for myself, he didn't know how to face this transformation. The silence between us lingered, but I couldn't continue living in meaningless sacrifice, couldn't keep doing everything for a family that didn't give me the respect I deserved. I was so tired of proving my worth by doing everything without ever being acknowledged. When dinner came, the tension still hung in the air. Michael ate in silence, not saying a word. Heather was still busy with her phone, glancing at me occasionally, but not speaking. I didn't expect any thanks or sympathy from them, but the silence haunted me. It felt like indifference, a coldness I had lived with for so many years. We ate dinner in silence, but I could sense the change in the family. Michael seemed bewildered, while Heather was a bit tense. She couldn't understand why I had changed, and I knew this would make both of them uncomfortable. But I couldn't continue living for them. They needed to understand that my sacrifice wasn't something they could take for granted. They needed to see me as a person, not just a tool to solve everything in their lives. When I finished the meal and stood up, Michael was the first to speak. "Mom, I don't understand why you're doing this," he began, his voice filled with confusion and disappointment. "We've lived this way for so many years. You've always helped, always done everything without complaining. Why have you changed?" I didn't rush to answer. I looked at him, into his eyes, where I could see his confusion and disappointment. "Michael," I said softly but firmly, "I've sacrificed too long without receiving respect. I love this family, but that doesn't mean I should do everything without ever being recognized. I can't live like this anymore." My words were a shock to him. Michael fell silent, his eyes still fixed on me, but he couldn't say anything. For years, he had been so used to me, always being there, always doing everything without expecting anything in return. And now, when I started demanding respect, he didn't know how to respond. Heather sat silently, staring at me for a long time, as though she wanted to understand better what I had just said. After a moment, she spoke. "Mom, you can't do this. We'll face consequences. If you don't continue doing the housework, everything will fall apart. I can't do everything myself." Her voice filled with worry, but also a bit of reproach. I looked into Heather's eyes, feeling the tension in every word she spoke. "Heather, I know you need help, but I can't keep sacrificing without receiving respect. I've done everything for you, but now I need space for myself, time for me. I'm not the maid of this family." Heather said nothing more, remaining silent, but I could see the clear disappointment in her eyes. She couldn't understand why I had changed, and that change made her feel insecure. But I knew I had done the right thing. After that dinner, I began to feel the unmistakable shift in the family atmosphere, and Michael and Heather no longer saw me as someone they could ask for everything without a second thought. They began to realize that I had the right to say no, and that discomforted them. But I couldn't continue living in this state. I couldn't be their free servant anymore. I needed to be loved, respected, and to have the right to live for myself. The next morning, I received a letter. It was from Ethan's school. My heart raced as I saw the words "important letter" printed on the envelope. I didn't know why, but a sense of unease rose in me as I opened it. Heather noticed I was reading the letter and walked over. She looked at me, then glanced down at the letter, and her expression changed. "Ethan hasn't paid the tuition?" Heather asked, her voice tense and somewhat angry. "What have you done? How could you let this happen?" That question hit me like a shock. Although I knew I had stopped paying the tuition for Ethan, I hadn't expected it to surprise the family so much. "I'm not paying the tuition anymore. That was my decision," I replied, my tone cold but certain. You both need to become independent, and I can't keep doing everything for you." Heather looked at me, then down at the letter, and once again remained silent. She seemed upset, but there was nothing more I could do except continue living for myself. I had given my all for so many years, and now it was time to set boundaries. Michael and Heather didn't say anything further that morning, but I knew they felt the change in me. It wasn't easy for them, but I also knew that without this change, I wouldn't be able to continue living. I couldn't keep living for them. I had to live for myself. My first no wasn't just a refusal to do a household task. It was an affirmation of the freedom and respect that I deserved. And when I said no to doing the housework, when I began to ask for what I deserved, I knew I was stepping into a new path, one that not only I, but my entire family would have to learn how to face the change. That day, when I decided I wouldn't back down, I had no idea I was standing on the threshold of an irreversible change. I had rejected all of Michael and Heather's requests, tasks that had become a routine for me over the years. I thought my silence and the first no would only confuse the family, but in reality, it created a profound shift in the family atmosphere. Not only Michael and Heather, but even I felt a significant difference. That morning, when I woke up and sat down at the breakfast table, that feeling came again. Strange yet comforting. I no longer worried about breakfast, about cleaning the house. I wasn't rushing to do everything because of endless requests. I simply sat there, drinking coffee, looking out the window, feeling the quiet space around me with no rush, no busyness. This was the first time I could truly enjoy this peace. In the past, I always felt like I had to do something to deserve the love of my family. But now, I understood that I was not a tool to be used for endless work. I deserved to live for myself. That morning, Michael entered the dining room and I saw the change in his eyes. He didn't say anything, but I knew he was thinking about what had happened over the past few days. He looked at me for a long time, then finally spoke. "Mom," his voice tired, "I don't understand why you're doing this. You've always been the one to help us. What now?" I didn't rush to answer. I looked at him without hesitation and gently said, "Michael, I've done everything for so many years without ever being thanked or respected. It's time for me to live for myself, not just for you anymore." My words were simple, but they hit him like a punch to the heart. Michael fell silent, stood for a moment, then sat down without saying anything further. I could feel the pain in his eyes, but I also knew that I couldn't keep living for him forever. My change, though surprising to him, was something I had to do. Heather then walked into the dining room, her gaze flickering over me, but she didn't speak. She didn't ask why I had changed, didn't try to change my mind, just remained silent. This silence made me acutely aware that the gap between us was growing, one that I couldn't avoid. Heather might not understand, but I knew she too had to face this change. She wasn't used to me saying no to the housework, to me beginning to live for myself. But I knew this change was necessary, not just for me, but for the family as well. A while later, Ethan walked in. He didn't say anything, but just looked at me with those innocent, pure eyes. I could see that Ethan didn't understand my change, but he sat next to me silently, as if waiting for me to say something. I looked at him, and in my heart, I felt a deep sadness. He didn't deserve to bear the weight of these changes, but I also couldn't keep living just for his presence. Ethan deserved a family that loved him, and I deserved to live with my own dignity. I began to think about the days before when I was the one always taking care of the family, when I was always behind every success and happiness they had. I had given everything to them, but I hadn't received respect in return. I had given too much. But now, I needed to love myself. I needed to find myself again. And when I made that decision, I knew it wouldn't be easy. Not only my family, but even I had to face this change. By the end of the week, I began to notice the clear change in Michael and Heather. Michael no longer talked about the housework, but he silently watched me. He didn't understand why I had changed, but I felt I didn't need to explain anymore. As for Heather, she no longer asked me to do little tasks, but I could feel the tension in our relationship. She may not understand yet, but I no longer wanted to live in self-pity, in the endless acceptance of sacrifice. Sometimes, loving yourself is the best way to love others. Then, everything came to a head on that day. An unavoidable conversation between me and Michael. He sought me out when I was sitting in the living room, reading a book, as though he could no longer bear the tension between us. "Mom," Michael began, his voice soft but heavy with weight. "You can't keep doing this. We need you. You can't just give up everything without thinking about the family. Ethan needs you. I need you. You can't do this." I looked at him, and in that moment, I saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the confusion, and the disappointment. But I knew I had to stand firm. "Michael, I've done enough. I've sacrificed too much, and I haven't received anything but contempt. It's time for me to live for myself. I can't continue living for you without living for myself." Michael didn't say anything further. He just stood there, sighed, but couldn't argue with me. I knew my words might hurt him, but I also knew I couldn't keep living like this. I had lived for them for so many years, and now it was time to live for myself. By the end of the day, I sat in the living room, looking out the window. The view was the same, but I felt a powerful change within myself. My first no wasn't just a refusal of a request. It was a firm decision to protect myself. I was no longer the person Michael and Heather could exploit unconditionally. And though this made them uncomfortable, I couldn't keep living in meaningless sacrifice. I don't know what the future holds, but I know that each day that passes, I'll slowly find myself again. Each day, I'll learn how to love myself and love my family in the way I deserve. My first no wasn't just the refusal of a small task. It was the beginning of a new life, a life that I would live for myself. Since the day I decided to stop doing the housework, everything seemed to change. At first, this shift was just a gentle refusal, a rejection of tasks that had been my routine for so many years. But as time passed, I began to realize that this change didn't just surprise my family. It also had a deep impact on me. Each day, I felt stronger, more self-sufficient, and, most importantly, I felt that I deserved to be loved and respected. This feeling wasn't easy, but it brought me a sense of liberation I had never experienced before. For years, I had lived for others, sacrificed too much for this family, without receiving the respect I deserved. At this point, I understood that I couldn't keep living like that. I needed to live for myself, and I couldn't do that unless I began setting clear boundaries with my loved ones. That morning, when I woke up and sat at the breakfast table, I noticed the atmosphere in the house felt strangely unfamiliar. Michael didn't say anything, and I didn't want to start a conversation. I quietly drank my coffee, looking out the window, savoring the peace that I'd never had before. Heather came in and started making breakfast for herself without saying a word. The room was filled with silence, as if everyone was reflecting on what had happened in the past few days. After breakfast, Michael was the first to speak. "Mom, I don't understand why you've changed like this," he began, his voice trying to control his confusion. "I've always been used to you doing everything. You can't just change like this." I didn't answer immediately. I looked at him, not with anger or sadness, but with calm eyes, looking directly at him. "Michael, you won't understand right away, and I can't explain everything to you. But I've done enough. I need to live for myself. I've sacrificed for so many years without receiving respect, and now it's time for me to change." Michael fell silent, not reacting immediately. He didn't say anything further, but just turned around and walked into his office. I could feel the disappointment in his eyes, but I couldn't worry about his feelings anymore. I had made my decision, and I knew this change was necessary, not only for me, but for this entire family. Heather stood there, saying nothing, but I could clearly see the confusion in her posture. "Mom, you can't do this. We need you," Heather said, but this time her voice wasn't accusatory, but rather filled with worry, as if she didn't know what to do in this situation. She no longer asked me to do the housework, but I could feel the tension in our relationship. She didn't know how to deal with this change. I looked at Heather, and in that moment, I understood that she couldn't fully grasp the extent of this change. She didn't know that I had spent my life loving and caring for the family, but now I couldn't keep doing everything without receiving respect. I couldn't keep living in unreciprocated sacrifice, doing everything for the family without feeling like a person, but rather just a tool. "We can't keep going on like this," I said, my voice firm but still gentle. "You can't keep living for others while forgetting yourself. I've lived for you all for so long, but now it's time for me to live for myself." Both Heather and Michael were silent. No one said anything more. But that silence wasn't one of harmony. It was the silence of misunderstanding and tension. They couldn't understand my decision, and I couldn't make them understand. What mattered was that I had done what was right for myself. Day by day, I felt the change in the family. Michael no longer asked me to do the housework, but sometimes I would catch his gaze, the helplessness in his eyes. He didn't know what to do, and I couldn't help him. That feeling wasn't one of satisfaction or joy, but rather emptiness, as if I had lost a part of something in this family. However, I understood that this change was necessary. Sometimes, people need to go through pain to find the truth. Heather began facing the housework on her own. I didn't help her, and that made her feel exhausted. She had been used to me doing everything for her, but now, when I wasn't doing anything, she had to manage everything herself. Sometimes I looked at her with a bit of sympathy, but I couldn't change my decision. This was the time she needed to learn to do things for herself and become independent. She couldn't depend on me forever. During those days, I gradually sensed the tension in the family. Michael and Heather no longer spoke to me as much. They didn't ask me about housework, didn't request anything from me, but I could feel their disappointment and unease in their eyes. My change wasn't easy for them to accept. However, I also knew that if I didn't change, I would continue living in unreciprocated sacrifice, while my family wouldn't understand the value of what I did. One evening, When the whole family sat down for dinner, the silence that hung in the air only made me feel that this change was necessary. Michael and Heather looked at me, but didn't say anything. Ethan, too, remained silent, not daring to ask me why everything had changed. I didn't feel tense, but I knew this was a major turning point for all of us. I no longer did the housework. I no longer lived for them. I lived for myself, and that was what I needed to do. In the days that followed, I began to notice the change in myself. I no longer felt exhausted, no longer felt burdened by the housework I had done for so many years. I no longer worried about pleasing everyone. I began living a free life, where I had the right to choose what I wanted to do. And while my family was still confused and didn't understand this change, I knew I had done the right thing. Respect starts with myself, and I would never go back to doing things I didn't want to do just because of unreciprocated sacrifice. Over the years, I had lived for others, doing everything I could to make my family happy, without asking for anything in return. But eventually, I realized that I could no longer live just to please everyone around me. I, too, had the right to live for myself. Refusing to do the housework and beginning to set boundaries with my family was the first step in asserting myself. And even though no one in my family fully understood, I knew I had done the right thing. However, change is never easy, and the days that followed brought challenges I will never forget. After I refused to continue doing the housework, something I had done tirelessly for years, without complaint, it wasn't surprising that Michael and Heather felt confused. They didn't say anything, but I could sense the change in their eyes. The silence between us grew thicker, and though no one spoke, we all knew that the family had changed permanently. This feeling, while it gave me a sense of relief from the burden, also made me question if I had done the right thing. That day, I sat in the garden as usual, reading a book I had set aside for so long. I had never had time to devote to myself like this before. I used to think I didn't have the right or the time to do the things I enjoyed. But now, without the worry of housework, I was starting to live for myself. The peaceful garden, the sunlight filtering through the leaves, made me feel a deep calm in my soul. I no longer felt like a woman trapped in responsibility, in the endless demands from my family. As I sat in the garden, a soft footstep echoed behind me. I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Ethan, the boy who always made me smile no matter how difficult things were, was standing there, his face thoughtful. I couldn't speak right away. He was a part of this family that I had always loved unconditionally. But at that moment, I knew that, even though he was just a child, he too had to face the changes I had brought about. His world was no longer the same. "Grandma," Ethan spoke, his voice hesitant, as if he had been silently reflecting on what had happened in the family. He stood still, not daring to look at me, his eyes filled with some kind of apprehension. I'm sorry." I paused my reading and looked up. He stood there, his innocent eyes filled with embarrassment and worry. I could tell he wanted to say something important, but didn't know how. His apology hit me like a wave. A simple apology, but one that carried great weight in this context. "Sorry for what, Ethan?" I asked, my voice gentle, trying to make him feel comfortable enough to open up. "You don't need to worry about me." Ethan shook his head, his eyes suddenly welling up with tears. "I didn't know that I hurt you when I slapped you that day," he said, his voice choking. "I just thought it was funny. Mom and Dad always laughed when I did that." I didn't know it made you hurt." His words made my heart ache in a way I couldn't describe. He didn't understand that his actions had hurt me, but I couldn't blame him because he was just a child, learning from the world around him. He acted the way he saw others in the family act, in the environment where he was raised. But in that moment, I realized that he was a part of a cycle I had unintentionally created, a cycle I had been living in for years. I stepped toward him and hugged him tightly, as if to soothe the worries in my heart. The warmth of him in my arms calmed my heart. "It's okay, Ethan," I whispered. "I understand. You're not to blame. I'm not mad at you. You're just a child, and I love you." Ethan looked at me, his eyes lighting up as if he was starting to understand something deeper. "I won't do that again, Grandma," he said, his voice full of promise, as if he wanted to make up for what he had done. And that promise, though innocent, made me feel at peace. Even though he was still young, he had learned an important lesson about caring and respecting others. And I, despite the heartache, couldn't help but feel proud of him. After the conversation with Ethan, I began to notice something. I wasn't the only one in the family who was changing. Though Michael and Heather didn't speak, I knew they were beginning to realize that I was no longer someone they could demand everything from without thinking. It was time for me to stand up, not just for myself, but for them. We all needed to change, and though this change was difficult, it would bring long-term happiness. The next day, when Michael entered the living room, he looked at me differently. He no longer had the doubt or confusion in his eyes like before. Instead, his gaze contained understanding, though not fully accepted. "Mom," Michael began, his voice softer. "I don't understand everything right now, but I know you need to live for yourself. I respect you. I know you've done too much, and I can't ask you to do everything anymore." These words from Michael made me feel as though a part of me had been healed. I knew he hadn't fully understood everything, but at least he had acknowledged my sacrifices and began to respect me more. Not everything would change immediately, but at least I wasn't alone in this decision anymore. As for Heather, she stayed silent for a long while before walking over to me. She didn't need to say anything, just a look filled with regret. "I'm sorry, Mom," Heather said, her voice gentle and full of respect. "I didn't understand what you've been through, but I know you don't deserve to suffer like this. You deserve to be loved and respected." Hearing these words from Heather was indescribable. Although she hadn't fully understood, at least she had realized what I needed. The love and respect I had been seeking for so long were finally being reciprocated by my family. After days of quiet reflection, as I started to decline the requests of my family and began living for myself, I realized something important. Change is never easy, especially when it affects the people you love most. Though my decision was driven by the necessity to regain control over my life, I couldn't help but notice that the silence and tension between me and my family grew thicker with each passing day. We didn't speak much, but I felt a widening gap between the people I had devoted my life to loving and caring for. Looking back, I realized I was no longer the mother or grandmother they once knew. I was no longer the one always ready to do everything for them without ever asking for anything in return. This change wasn't just about housework, it was about how I saw myself. It wasn't easy, but I knew that if I didn't change, I would never get the respect I deserved. One late afternoon, as the sunset light filtered through the window, I sat in silence in the living room, enjoying the calm. The house remained quiet, but I could sense that everything was slowly changing. Michael entered the room, his eyes slightly weary, but there was no longer the confusion or uncertainty that had been there before. He looked at me deeply, as if he was preparing to say something important. "Mom," Michael began, his voice softer than usual. "I can't explain everything right now, but I want you to know that I respect your decision. I know you've lived your whole life for this family, and now you have the right to do what you want." His words made me feel as if a part of me had healed. Michael no longer tried to change me. Instead, he accepted and respected my change. These words weren't just comforting, they were an acknowledgement. I didn't need to live just to please others anymore. Sometimes, understanding comes from the simplest things. And today, I realize that. "I've sacrificed enough," I replied, my voice gentle but determined. "I need to live for myself. And you need to learn to live for yourself, Michael. We can't keep living for others and forget about ourselves." He nodded, silent for a few seconds, then stood up. "I'll try, Mom. I understand now." Michael's change wasn't something that could be noticed immediately. He didn't fully understand everything, but at least he had begun to realize that I, too, deserved to live a life that was as valuable as the one I had devoted to the family. And that was the most important thing for me. Soon after, Heather entered the room. She didn't speak right away, but there was a noticeable change in her gaze. Unlike before, when she looked at me with disappointment or confusion, this time, her eyes carried respect and a touch of regret. "I'm sorry, Mom," Heather said, her voice soft and sincere. "I can't fully understand everything you've been through, but I know you've sacrificed too much, and I didn't realize that. You deserve to rest, to be loved and respected." Heather's words made my heart stir. This wasn't the apology I had once hoped for, but it was the apology I needed. She didn't just acknowledge my sacrifices, she also recognized that I had the right to change, to live for myself without continuing to sacrifice without respect. This was a huge step forward for us, and I knew that things would get better from here. "You don't need to apologize, Heather," I said, my eyes glistening with emotion. "All I need is respect and love. I've given so much, and now I just need you to understand that I, too, have the right to love myself." Heather didn't say anything else, but I felt a sense of harmony in our relationship. We didn't need to say more because everything was understood. The change in me didn't just make me stronger, it also made my family begin to see me differently. We had started learning how to love and respect each other in a new way. Later that evening, I entered the living room and saw Ethan sitting on the sofa, his eyes anxiously watching me. He was no longer the innocent child I had once known. He had begun to realize that his actions could affect others, and he didn't want to hurt me. I walked over to him, sat beside him, and looked at him. "Do you want to say something to me?" I asked, my voice gentle. Ethan looked up, his eyes hesitant. "Grandma, I'm sorry for hurting you before. I didn't know it made you sad. I love you, and I won't do it again." He said these words simply, but I could feel the sincerity in every sentence. Ethan's apology wasn't just from a child. It was from a heart that wanted to make things right. He wasn't the one who hurt me. It was the environment he had grown up in that had influenced his actions. But now, he understood that love wasn't just about affection. It was also about caring for others' feelings. I hugged Ethan, softly whispering, "I'm not mad at you. I love you and always will. What's important is that you know you can't hurt others, and I'm proud of you for understanding that." I could feel Ethan relaxing, as if he had released a burden in his heart. That feeling was wonderful, because it wasn't just forgiveness from me, but a sign of Ethan's growth in understanding. The evening passed in gentle silence. The whole family sat together. No hasty words, no tension or criticism. We were simply there, together, and I sensed that the process of reconciliation had begun. Not everything was perfect, but I knew we had entered a new phase. A phase where we would learn to love and respect each other more, not just through actions, but through understanding and acceptance. The change in me wasn't just about refusing housework, it was about refusing to live a life that held no value for myself. And as I began to love myself, I also learned how to love my family in a proper way. This is a journey, not a destination, and I know that many challenges lie ahead. But I also know that no matter the difficulty, I will never go back to living in meaningless sacrifice. In the end, the change wasn't about revenge, but about restoration. It was a journey filled with tears, sacrifice, and long nights of contemplating one's true worth. She wasn't seeking vengeance. She was reclaiming her right to make choices, to be loved, and to be respected. The family may change, but when we learn to love ourselves, that becomes the greatest power to heal all wounds. Forgiveness doesn't come instantly, but her steps changed everything. When respect returned, the family also found their way back to each other. This story isn't just for a mother or grandmother, but for anyone who has lived for others while forgetting themselves. Amidst the ruins, among the broken pieces of the past, we can find the strength to begin again. And perhaps the greatest blessings in life come when we dare to love ourselves first. Share this story if you've ever gone through a similar journey. Your thoughts and reflections can be a source of motivation for those fighting their own battles. Comment below and let us know what you think about this journey.